The darkness had weight, 400 tons of it, and Hannah Graves was counting breaths the way she used to count core samples methodically, cataloging what remained. 32 heartbeats per minute now, down from 40 an hour ago, her body surrendering oxygen to preserve the brain that had signed off on Shaft 7, the brain that had killed 31 men with a pen stroke and a confidence she would never, if she lived, permit herself again. The rock around her pocket of air groaned and settled, granite talking to limestone in the language of geological time, and she mapped each sound against the seam structure she had memorized, calculating which shift would be the last. Then she heard something that did not belong. Stone was moving, but not settling. Something was displacing mass, rhythmically, with the patience of erosion and the force of a hydraulic press. She held her breath, which was foolish because she had so few to spare, and listened to the sound of boulders being torn apart by hands, not machinery. Hands. She had been a geologist for 6 years, 3 of them in deep extraction, and she knew the acoustic signature of every piece of equipment that touched rock. This was none of them. This was something pulling stone from stone with the methodical precision of a surgeon and the raw strength of a continental plate. The sound grew closer. Dust rained from the ceiling of her tiny cave, and she pressed herself flat against the rubble beneath her, suddenly uncertain whether rescue or something worse was tunneling toward her position. A boulder the size of a compact car shifted above her head, and moonlight poured through the gap. Moonlight. She had been buried in Shaft 7 at 2 in the afternoon, and Shaft 7 was 300 meters below the surface. There should be no moonlight, no sky, no air that smelled like winter and old stone, and something else, something that made her hindbrain scream. A hand reached through the gap. It was pale, corpse pale, and the fingers were too long and the nails were the color of old ivory. And it moved with the unhurried grace of something that had never known fatigue. It grasped the boulder she had been using as a roof beam and pulled, and the rock came away like styrofoam. And then there was space, and air, and a face looking down at her that belonged in a painting. Not a mine white hair that fell past his shoulders, colorless in the moonlight but shimmering like spider silk. Skin so pale it seemed to hold its own luminescence, stretched over bones that were too fine, too perfect, the geometry of something designed rather than evolved. Eyes that were black from lid to lid, no white, no iris, just depthless dark that swallowed light and gave nothing back. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he spoke. "Be still." His voice was quiet, hardly more than a whisper, but it carried a weight that made her bones resonate. She did not move, could not have moved if she tried, and he reached down and pulled away another boulder, then another, clearing the rubble with the efficiency of something that had done this many times before. When the space was wide enough, he slid through the gap and landed beside her without sound. He was tall, she realized, taller than anyone she had ever met, and he moved like water, like shadow, like nothing human. He crouched beside her and she saw his nostrils flare once, and something changed in his face, a tightening around the eyes that might have been concern or might have been hunger. "You are injured," he said. "My leg," she managed. Her voice was a rasp, her throat lined with dust. "Crushed below the knee. I can't feel it anymore." He looked down and his expression went cold. Her left leg was buried under a slab of limestone that had to weigh 300 kilos. He reached for it and she wanted to tell him not to bother, that moving it would bring the rest of the ceiling down, but he grasped the edge of the slab and lifted it with one hand, held it suspended while he pulled her free with the other, and set it down as gently as if it were glass. Her leg was ruined, the boot crushed flat, bone visible through torn denim. She looked at it with the distant curiosity of shock and thought, clinical and calm, that she was going to lose it below the knee. "Can you climb?" he asked. She laughed, which hurt, which made her laugh again because pain meant she was alive. "No." He studied her for another moment, and then he gathered her against his chest in a motion so swift she barely registered it, one arm beneath her knees, the other supporting her back. She had time to notice that he was cold, that his body had no warmth at all, and then he was moving, climbing the shaft he had carved through solid rock with a speed that made her stomach drop. They emerged into moonlight and winter air, and she gasped at the cold and the space and the impossible fact of sky. They were on the surface 100 meters from the mine entrance, and the ground was littered with emergency vehicles and searchlights and men in reflective vests who had stopped what they were doing and were staring. He set her down on the frozen earth, careful of her leg, and straightened. Someone shouted and people began running toward them, and he looked down at her one last time. "You will survive," he said, and then he turned and walked away, vanishing into the tree line before anyone could reach him. Hannah lay on the ground and watched the stars wheel overhead and thought distantly that she had just been carried out of hell by something that was not human, and that nothing in her life would ever make sense again. They airlifted her to Denver General, where a trauma surgeon who looked too young to have finished med school told her they could save the leg. Barely. She would need 3 surgeries, 6 months of physical therapy, and she would walk with a limp for the rest of her life, but she would walk. She asked about the miners. The surgeon looked uncomfortable. 4 confirmed dead, he said. 27 still missing. They are calling it a recovery operation now, not a rescue. 4 dead, 27 missing. 31 men whose wives and children were waiting at the surface, hoping for a miracle that was not going to come. 31 lives that Hannah had ended when she signed the safety report that cleared Shaft 7 for deep drilling. She closed her eyes and felt the weight of the rock all over again. They operated twice in the first week, pinning bone and grafting skin and doing things with titanium rods that she tried not to think about. The pain was manageable with enough morphine, and the nightmares were not, and she spent the hours between surgeries staring at the ceiling and counting breaths, just like she had under the rock. On the 8th day, a man in an expensive suit came to her room and introduced himself as Marcus Thorne, CEO of Silver Peak Mining, the company that owned the land and the mine and by extension her career. He sat beside her bed and folded his hands and told her, very gently, that the collapse had been an act of God, that she was not to blame herself, that the company would cover all her medical expenses and offer a generous settlement in exchange for her discretionary silence regarding the incident. Hannah looked at him with the kind of clarity that only comes from morphine and exhaustion and asked, "What are you hiding?" His smile did not waver. "Nothing that concerns you, Miss Graves. The investigation is ongoing. These things take time. I reviewed the core samples myself," she said. "The rock was stable. Shaft 7 should not have collapsed. And yet it did." He stood, smoothing his jacket. "Rest, Miss Graves. Heal. We will take care of everything else." He left, and Hannah lay in the clean white bed and felt the weight of something worse than rock settling on her chest. They discharged her 3 weeks after the collapse with a walking cast, a prescription for oxycodone that she had no intention of filling, and a settlement check that felt like blood money. She took a cab back to Silver Ridge, the mining town of 4,000 that had grown around the Silver Peak operations, and found her apartment exactly as she had left it, coffee mug still in the sink, geology texts still open on the kitchen table, a life that belonged to someone who had not yet killed 31 men. The town was different, quieter. The bars were full at noon, and the church parking lot was never empty, and everywhere she went, people stared, some with sympathy, some with something harder. She had been home for 2 days when the knock came. She opened the door and found a woman in her 60s with iron gray hair and a face carved from grief. "You are the geologist," the woman said. "Yes. My son was in Shaft 7, Daniel Riker. He was 24. Hannah's throat closed. "I am so sorry. They found him yesterday," the woman continued, and her voice was very steady, the kind of steady that comes from holding something too heavy for too long. "Crushed. They had to identify him by his wedding ring." She paused. "His wife is 8 months pregnant." Hannah could not speak. "I did not come here for an apology," the woman said. "I came to tell you that they are lying, Silver Peak, about the collapse." She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, pressed it into Hannah's hand. "My son sent this to me 2 days before the collapse. He was scared. He said they found something in the deep gallery, something they were not supposed to find, and the company told them to keep drilling anyway." Hannah unfolded the paper. It was a photograph taken on a phone of a stone wall carved with symbols that were definitely not natural and definitely not modern. The wall had been broken through, and beyond it was darkness and the suggestion of space, a chamber or a passage leading deeper into the earth. "What is this?" Hannah asked. "I was hoping you could tell me." Hannah studied the symbols. They were not any language she recognized, but they had the deliberate precision of writing, and they were old, very old. Older than the town, older than the mine, older than anything that should be 300 meters below the Colorado Rockies. "I will find out," she said. The woman nodded and turned to leave, and then she stopped and looked back. "They pulled you out," she said. "You were the only one. How?" Hannah thought of pale hands and black eyes and a voice that made her bones resonate. "I do not know," she said, which was not quite a lie. She spent the next week in the county records office, digging through land deeds and geological surveys and mining permits that went back to the 1880s when Silver Ridge was still a silver camp and not a lithium operation. The land had changed hands a dozen times, but there was a gap in the records, a 20-year period between 1890 and 1910 where no one seemed to own the land at all, and no one seemed to mine it. She found a reference to the gap in a Historical Society newsletter from 1972. Written by a local amateur historian who had spent 40 years researching the town's founding. He noted the gap and added in a footnote that local Ute oral tradition claimed the valley had been forbidden ground, that something had been sealed there long before the white settlers arrived, and that the silver miners who broke the seal in 1889 had vanished to a man. Hannah sat in the quiet library and felt her hands go cold. She needed more information, and she needed it from someone who had been there. And there was only one person she knew who had pulled stone apart with bare hands and walked away from 100 emergency responders without leaving a name. She had no idea how to find him. The answer came 2 nights later when she woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of something moving on her balcony. She lived on the 3rd floor and there was no fire escape, and when she turned on the light he was standing outside the glass door, looking in. She should have screamed. She should have called the police. Instead, she got out of bed, limped across the room, and opened the door. "You have questions," he said. "Yes." He stepped inside, moving with that same liquid grace, and she closed the door behind him and turned on the lamp. In the light, he was even less human than she remembered. His skin was not just pale but faintly translucent, showing the faint tracery of veins that did not pulse. His hair fell to his mid-back, perfectly white, and his eyes were still black, still depthless, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to step back and step forward at the same time. "You are healing," he observed. Slowly, she leaned against the wall, taking weight off her bad leg. "Who are you?" "Obsidian Dramar, that is not a name from around here." "I am not from around here." She waited, and when he did not elaborate, she tried a different angle. "You own the land, the mine." Something flickered in his expression, surprise or approval. "Yes, for how long?" 230 years. Hannah had expected something strange, but hearing it said aloud, calm and matter-of-fact, was different. "That is not possible. You are speaking to a man who pulled you from 300 meters of collapsed stone without machinery. Reassess your definition of possible." She laughed, sharp and short, and leaned harder against the wall. "Fine. You are old. You are strong. You are not human. What are you?" "I believe your current terminology would be vampire." Vampire. The word hung in the air between them, ridiculous and impossible, and the only thing that made sense. She thought of his strength, his speed, his cold skin, the way he moved without sound, and she felt something slot into place in her understanding of the world, something that changed the shape of everything else. "Vampires are real," she said. "Yes, and you are a king." His expression went very still. "How did you know that? You move like someone who has never bowed. You speak like someone who expects to be obeyed. And you pulled me out of that mine first, before any of the others." She met his eyes. "Why?" He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Very simply, you were the only one still alive." The words hit like a fist. Hannah closed her eyes and felt the weight of it, the 31 lives lost while she was counting breaths in her pocket of air. And when she opened her eyes again, Obsidian was closer. Close enough that she could see the faint silver fractures in the black of his eyes, like ice cracking on a frozen lake. "It was not your fault," he said, and his voice was quiet, but it carried that same resonance, that weight that made her believe him even when she did not want to. "I signed the report," she said. "I cleared the shaft." "You cleared the shaft based on the information you were given. The collapse was not caused by geological instability. It was caused by something waking up." She stared at him. "What?" He moved past her, into the small living room, and she followed, limping, her heart starting to pound. He stood by the window, looking out at the dark town, and when he spoke, his voice was distant, the tone of someone remembering something old and painful. 200 years ago, there was a vampire in this valley. His name was Lucien, and he was older than I, more powerful and mad with it. He slaughtered a village 20 miles north of here, every man, woman, and child, and when I found him, he was bathing in their blood and laughing." Obsidian's hands curled into fists. "I fought him for 3 days. In the end, I could not kill him, but I could contain him. I sealed him in a gallery beneath the mountain, behind stone and blood wards, and I have held that seal for 2 centuries, until the mine broke through," Hannah said. "Yes, and he caused the collapse." "Yes, the moment the drill breached the gallery, he woke. The wards were broken. He was weak, starving, but he had enough strength to bring the mountain down, and he did, because that is what Lucien does. He destroys." Hannah sank into the chair behind her, her bad legs screaming. "The miners. Did he know? He is still contained, barely. The collapse sealed most of the breach, but he is awake now, and he is aware, and he is very patient." Obsidian turned from the window and looked at her. "The company knows. They have known for months." "What?" "The core samples they gave you were falsified. They found the gallery 4 months ago, and they found Lucien, and they made a deal with him." Hannah felt the bottom drop out of her understanding. "What kind of deal?" "Blood for information. He is old, Hannah. He knows where the richest veins are, where the mineral deposits run deepest. He has been feeding them that information, and in exchange they send men down to him. Not many. 1 every few weeks. Enough to keep him alive, not enough to make him strong." "That is insane. That is business." His voice was cold now, colder than his skin, and she heard the anger beneath it, old and deep. "They believed they could control him. They believed the wards would hold, that the gallery was stable. They were wrong." Hannah stood too fast and her leg buckled. Obsidian was there before she could fall, catching her, his hands on her arms, and she looked up into those black eyes and felt something electric run through her, fear and attraction and the dizzying sense of standing too close to a cliff edge. "How do you know all this?" she asked. "Because I have been watching. Because I felt the wards break and I have been trying to assess the damage, and because 3 days ago I intercepted a foreman on his way down to the gallery with a bag of blood and a list of questions about the lithium yield projections for the next quarter." She pulled back and he let her go, his hands dropping to his sides. "Where is the foreman now?" "Gone. He left town the next day. I believe the company realized I was aware and decided to cut their losses. Then we need to go to the authorities. The police, the FBI, someone, and tell them what? That a mining company made a deal with a vampire in exchange for geological data? That 31 men died because a 200-year-old monster wanted to feel the sun again?" He shook his head. "They will not believe you. They will think you are mad, or traumatized, or trying to escape liability. And by the time they investigate, Lucien will be gone. Then what do? We seal him again, properly. Permanently. How? I do not know yet. The old wards took me 20 years to construct, and they required materials and rituals that no longer exist. I need time to research, to plan." He looked at her and his expression softened just slightly. "But I needed you to know. You have been blaming yourself, and you should not. This is not your fault. It is mine." "How is it your fault?" "I sealed him. I failed to ensure the seal would hold. I should have killed him when I had the chance, but He stopped, and for the first time she saw something uncertain in his face, something almost human. "I could not. He was my brother." The words hung between them, heavy and terrible. Hannah did not know what to say, so she said nothing, and after a moment Obsidian turned and moved toward the door. "Wait," she said. He stopped. "Let me help you." He turned back, and she saw surprise in his expression, genuine surprise, as if the offer had never occurred to him. "You are injured. You should be resting. I am a geologist. I know those tunnels better than anyone, and I owe those men. You owe them nothing. I owe them everything." She limped toward him, closing the distance, and she saw the moment he understood that she was not going to let this go. "You need me. You said the old wards required materials and rituals. I can help you find them. I can research, I can map the tunnels, You can die," he said, and his voice was sharp now, edged with something that might have been fear. "Lucien is awake and aware, and if he realizes I am trying to seal him again, he will do everything in his power to stop me. That includes killing anyone who helps me. Then we will have to work fast." They stared at each other, and she saw the conflict in his face, the desire to protect her warring with something else, something that looked like hope. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why would you risk this? Because 31 men died in that mine and their families deserve to know why. Because a company is trading human lives for profit and someone needs to stop them. And because you saved my life and I believe in returning favors." She paused. "And because I think you should not have to do this alone." Something changed in his expression, a crack in the cold perfection, and she saw beneath it to the person who had spent 200 years holding a seal against his own brother, who had lived in isolation and silence and the weight of a terrible choice. "Very well," he said quietly. "We will work together." She found him 3 nights later in the town's historical society, surrounded by books that had not been opened in decades. He had broken in through a basement window, which should have bothered her more than it did, and he was sitting cross-legged on the floor, reading by the light of a single lamp, his white hair pooling around him like spilled milk. "Find anything?" she asked. He looked up, unsurprised by her presence. "The Ute elder I mentioned. His name was Calls the Storm, and he was a shaman. He performed the original sealing ritual with me 200 years ago. He is dead, obviously, but his descendants may remember the details. The Ute Mountain Ute Reservation is 4 hours south. I know. Have you spoken to them?" "Not yet. I wanted to confirm the connection first." He closed the book and stood, moving with that eerie, fluid grace. "How is your leg?" "Functional." She limped over to the table and picked up one of the books, a leather-bound journal dated 1891. The handwriting inside was spidery and faded, but she could make out a few words. "Gallery, symbols, sealed. This is from the silver miners who vanished. Yes, one of them kept a journal. He describes finding a stone door carved with symbols they could not read. They broke through it anyway and something came out. He does not say what. The journal ends 3 days later." Hannah turned the pages carefully, reading the increasingly frantic entries, the descriptions of men vanishing from their tents, of blood on the rocks, of a figure that moved too fast to see. The final entry was a single line. "It is inside me now. I can feel it laughing." She closed the journal and set it down, her hands shaking. Lucien, yes. He was weaker then, newly sealed, and he could not maintain a physical form for long. But he could influence, manipulate, drive men to madness or murder. Obsidian's voice was flat, reciting facts, but she heard the pain beneath it. "By the time I arrived, 12 men were dead and the rest had fled. I reinforced the seals and buried the entrance. I thought that would be the end of it, but then Silver Peak came. Yes, they started drilling in the 40s, shallow operations. Nothing that reached the gallery. Then 10 years ago they discovered the lithium deposits, and they began drilling deeper, and I knew it was only a matter of time. He looked at her. I tried to buy the land from them. They refused. I tried to warn the EPA that the area was geologically unstable. They ignored me. I tried. He stopped, and she saw frustration and helplessness in his face, the expression of someone who had run out of options. You did what you could, she said. It was not enough. It never is. She leaned against the table, taking weight off her leg. But we can finish it now, together. He studied her for a long moment, and then he nodded. We leave tomorrow at sunset. The drive south was quiet. Obsidian sat in the passenger seat of her Jeep, watching the landscape slide past with an expression of deep concentration, and Hannah focused on the road and tried not to think about the fact that she was road tripping with a vampire king to ask a shaman's descendants how to reseal an ancient monster. They reached the reservation at midnight, and Obsidian directed her to a small house on the outskirts of the main settlement. An old man answered the door, his face a map of lines, and he looked at Obsidian for a long moment before he spoke. I wondered when you would return, he said in English, his accent soft and careful. My great-grandfather told me about you. He said you were the pale one who walked in winter, the king who wept over his brother's grave. Obsidian bowed his head, a gesture of respect Hannah had never seen him make. I am honored to meet a descendant of Calls the Storm. He was a great man, he was. Come in. The inside of the house was warm and cluttered, filled with books and photographs and the smell of sage. The old man introduced himself as Thomas Redfeather, and he made tea while Obsidian explained why they had come. Thomas listened without interrupting, and when Obsidian finished, he was quiet for a long time. My great-grandfather performed that ritual once, Thomas said finally. He told my grandfather it was the hardest thing he had ever done, that it required a sacrifice he was not sure he could make again. He never told anyone what the sacrifice was. Do you have his notes? His journals? Some. Most were burned after he died, according to his wishes. But there is one thing. Thomas stood and left the room, returning a moment later with a wooden box carved with symbols similar to the ones in the photograph. He opened it and pulled out a bundle of leather, unrolled it, and revealed a necklace made of bone and silver and something dark that might have been stone or might have been dried blood. He said this was the key, Thomas said, that the sealing required a bond of blood and will, a chain forged from love and tempered in sorrow. He said the vampire king gave something of himself to create it, something he could never take back. Obsidian reached out and touched the necklace, and Hannah saw his hand tremble. Yes, he said quietly. I remember. What did you give? She asked. He looked at her, and his expression was raw, stripped of the cold perfection he wore like armor. My humanity, or what was left of it. The ritual required a piece of my soul bound into the stone to hold Lucien in place. As long as the seal held, I could not leave this valley for more than a few days without weakening it. I have been tied to this place for 200 years, unable to travel, unable to leave, a prisoner of my own making. Hannah felt something twist in her chest, a sharp ache of sympathy and anger and grief for this being who had given up everything to contain a monster and had never asked for recognition or thanks. Can we use it again? She asked. Thomas shook his head. The bond is broken. The stone is fractured. You would need to forge a new one. And that requires the same sacrifice, maybe more. Then we will forge a new one, Hannah said. Both men looked at her, and she saw doubt in Thomas's face and something else in Obsidian's, something that looked like fear. You do not understand what you are offering, Obsidian said. Then explain it to me. He took a breath he did not need, a human gesture, and she realized he was trying to find the words. The ritual binds two souls together, one to hold the seal, one to anchor it. The holder gives up their freedom, their ability to leave. The anchor gives up, he stopped. Gives up what? Their mortality. The words fell into the space between them, and Hannah felt the weight of them settle on her shoulders. You are saying I would have to become a vampire. Yes. Would I have a choice after? You would have every choice. You would be free to leave, to live, to do as you wished. But you would be immortal, and the world you knew would age and die around you, and you would remain. He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. It is not a gift, Hannah. It is a curse. She thought about that for a long moment, turning the idea over in her mind like a core sample, examining it from every angle. She thought about her life, her career, the apartment in Silver Ridge, and the town that looked at her with sympathy and blame. She thought about the 31 men in the mine and the families they left behind. She thought about Obsidian, alone in this valley for 2 centuries, holding a seal against his own brother, and she thought about what it must have cost him to ask for help. How long would the new seal last, she asked, if we do it correctly? Forever. Lucien would be contained until the mountain itself eroded to dust, and the miners, the company, the gallery would be collapsed, the mine permanently closed. Silver Peak would be exposed and prosecuted. The families would have answers. She looked at Thomas, who was watching her with an expression of quiet respect, and then she looked at Obsidian, who was very still, waiting for her answer. "Then I will do it," she said. "Hannah, I will do it," she repeated, and her voice was steady, certain. "You saved my life. Now let me help you save everyone else." He stared at her for a long moment, and then he closed his eyes, and she saw something break in his expression, a relief so profound it looked like pain. "Thank you," he whispered. They spent the next 3 days preparing. Thomas taught them the ritual, walking them through each step, each word, each motion, and Hannah committed it to memory the way she used to memorize geological maps, layering detail on detail until she could recite it in her sleep. Obsidian was quieter than usual, his attention turned inward, and she caught him watching her sometimes with an expression she could not name. On the third night, he found her outside Thomas's house, sitting on the porch and looking up at the stars. "You do not have to do this," he said. She did not look at him. "We have had this conversation, I know, but I need to say it again. You are young, Hannah. You have your whole life ahead of you. A normal life, a human life. What if I do not want a normal life?" He was quiet, and she heard him settle beside her, his weight barely disturbing the boards. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Tell me the real reason." She thought about lying, about giving him the noble answer, the one about justice and responsibility and debt. But she was tired of lying, tired of pretending, and so she told him the truth. "Because I have spent 6 years studying rocks, mapping seams, calculating loads and stresses, and I have never felt like I was doing anything that mattered. I was good at my job, but it was just a job. And then the mine collapsed, and I thought I had killed 31 people, and I realized that nothing I had done in my entire life had made a difference to anyone." She looked at him then, meeting those black, depthless eyes. "This matters. This will save lives. And maybe when it is done, I will feel like I earned the right to survive when they did not." He reached out and took her hand, and his skin was cold, but his grip was gentle. "You did not need to earn that right. You were not responsible for their deaths. Maybe. But I can be responsible for making sure it does not happen again." He studied her hand in his, turning it over, tracing the calluses from fieldwork and the scars from a dozen small accidents. "You are braver than I am," he said quietly. "That is not true." "It is. I have lived for 500 years, and I have spent most of them hiding, running, avoiding the hard choices. You have lived for 27, and you are willing to give up your mortality to fix my mistakes." He looked up at her, and she saw something in his face that made her heart stutter. "I do not deserve your help. You pulled me out of a collapsed mine. I think that earns you a little help." He laughed, soft and low, and she realized it was the first time she had heard him laugh. It was a good sound, warm and real, and it made her want to hear it again. "When this is over," he said, "I will take you anywhere you want to go, anywhere in the world. You will have eternity, and I will make sure you do not waste a moment of it." She squeezed his hand. "I will hold you to that." They returned to Silver Ridge on the 4th day and began planning the descent. The mine was still closed, the entrance guarded by a single board security contractor who took a $200 bribe and a promise to look the other way. Obsidian had brought climbing gear, ropes, lights, and a leather satchel filled with items Thomas had given them: bone, silver, salt, and a knife that looked old enough to have tasted blood before. They entered the mine at midnight, and Hannah led the way with a headlamp and a map she had redrawn from memory. The tunnels were unstable, shored up with temporary bracing that groaned under the weight of the mountain, and twice they had to detour around collapses that had happened after the main event. Obsidian moved behind her, silent and watchful, and she felt his presence like a hand on her shoulder, steadying. They reached the deep gallery 2 hours later, and Hannah stopped at the threshold, staring. The breach was larger than she had expected, a ragged hole in the stone wall that led into a darkness so complete her headlamp barely penetrated it. The symbols carved around the breach were glowing faintly with a sickly green light, and the air smelled wrong, like copper and rot and something older. "He knows we are here," Obsidian said quietly. As if in response, a voice echoed from the darkness, smooth and cultured and amused. "Brother, how delightful! And you brought a pet." Hannah felt her skin crawl. The voice was not loud, but it carried a weight, a presence that pressed against her mind like a hand. She looked at Obsidian and saw his expression had gone cold, his eyes flat and hard. "Lucien," he said. "Obsidian, still playing the noble guardian, I see. Tell me, how many humans have died to maintain your precious seal? 30? 40? 31, Obsidian said, and his voice was like ice. 31 because of your games? My games? You are the one who buried me alive. I merely offered a mining company some friendly advice." The voice moved closer, circling, and Hannah realized with a jolt that Lucien was not in the gallery. He was in her head. "And now you have brought me a gift, a young, healthy human full of life and fear and delicious potential. You should not have. She is not for you." "Oh, but she is. She is standing at the threshold of my prison, and I can feel her heartbeat, her breath, her terror. She will taste exquisite." Hannah felt something brush against her mind, cold and invasive, and she stumbled back. Obsidian was there instantly, his hand on her arm, and she felt the presence retreat, hissing. "You cannot protect her forever," Lucien said. "The moment you start the ritual, you will be vulnerable, and I will be free. And I will make her scream, brother. I will make her beg. And you will listen to every moment of it. You will do nothing." Obsidian said, and his voice carried a power that made the stone around them resonate. "Because I am going to seal you again, and this time it will be permanent." Lucien laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. "You cannot. The old ritual required a piece of your soul, and you have nothing left to give. You are empty, brother, hollow. You used yourself up 200 years ago, and now you are just a ghost clinging to a purpose. Then I will find another way. There is no other way. The seal requires a sacrifice, a bond, a piece of something vital, and you have nothing vital left." The voice paused. "But she does." Hannah felt the presence circle her again, testing, and she clenched her fists and forced herself to stand still. "What is he talking about?" Obsidian did not answer, and she saw the truth in his silence, the thing he had not told her. "The ritual requires 2 sacrifices," she said slowly. "One to hold the seal, one to anchor it. You told me I would give up my mortality. What else? Hannah, what else?" He looked at her, and his expression was wretched. "Your ability to bear children. The ritual severs that connection because it requires a death, a potential that will never be realized. It is part of the cost." The words hit like a physical blow. Hannah took a step back, her mind racing. She had never thought much about children, had never been sure she wanted them, but the idea of having the choice taken away, of giving up that potential forever, was different. It was permanent. It was loss. "You should have told me," she said. "I know. I am sorry." She looked at him, at the guilt and pain in his face, and then she looked at the breach in the stone, at the glowing symbols and the darkness beyond, and she thought about the 31 men who had died, and the families they left behind, and the monster in the dark who would kill again if given the chance. "It does not change anything," she said. "Hannah, it does not change anything," she repeated, and her voice was steady. "I made my choice. Let us finish this." Obsidian stared at her, and she saw something break in his expression, something that looked like awe. "You are extraordinary," he said quietly. "I am stubborn. There is a difference." She adjusted her headlamp and pulled the satchel off her shoulder. "Tell me what to do." They worked quickly, setting up the ritual components in a circle around the breach: salt to purify, bone to bind, silver to seal. Obsidian drew symbols on the stone with a piece of chalk that glowed when it touched the rock, and Hannah followed his instructions, placing each item with precision, her hands steady despite the fear that thrummed through her veins. Lucien watched from the darkness, his presence a cold weight in the back of her mind, and he whispered poison as they worked, promises and threats and half-truths designed to make her doubt, to make her hesitate. She ignored him. When the circle was complete, Obsidian took the knife and held it out to her. "We need to bind our blood," he said. "A single cut, palm to palm. The bond will form when the ritual begins." She took the knife and pressed it to her palm, drew it across in a swift, clean line, and handed it back. Obsidian did the same, his blood darker than hers, almost black, and he pressed his palm to hers, their fingers interlacing. "Are you ready?" he asked. He began to speak, low and rhythmic, in a language she did not recognize. The words resonated in the air, in the stone, in her bones, and she felt something shift, a pressure building, a connection forming between them. She could feel his presence in her mind now, not invasive like Lucien, but warm, steady, a hand reaching out in the dark. The symbols on the wall began to glow brighter, and the air filled with a sound like singing, high and clear and almost painful. She felt her blood begin to burn, felt something deep inside her shift and tear, and she gritted her teeth and held on to Obsidian's hand, refusing to let go. Lucien screamed. It was a sound of rage and loss and desperation, and it filled the gallery, shaking the stone, cracking the support beams. The darkness beyond the breach surged forward, and she saw him for the first time, a figure of white skin and white hair and eyes that burned red, a mirror of obsidian twisted by madness and hunger. He lunged for her, his hand reaching through the breach, and Obsidian stepped between them, his free hand raised, and the air exploded with light. The force of it threw Hannah back, broke her grip on Obsidian's hand, and she hit the stone wall hard enough to black out for a moment. When her vision cleared, she saw Obsidian and Lucien locked together, their hands on each other's throats, and the stone around them was cracking, glowing, singing with power. "Finish it," Obsidian shouted, and his voice was ragged, strained. "Hannah, finish the ritual!" She staggered to her feet, her head spinning, and grabbed the satchel. The final component was a stone, black and smooth, carved with the same symbols as the necklace Thomas had shown them. She held it in her bleeding palm and spoke the words Obsidian had taught her, her voice hoarse but clear. The stone began to glow, brighter and brighter, until it was almost too painful to look at. She felt something inside her snap, a cord severing, a door closing, And she knew with absolute certainty that the choice she had made was irreversible. She did not care. She threw the stone into the breach, and the world exploded with light and sound and power. The stone wall sealed, the symbols flaring and then fading to dark, and Lucian's scream cut off abruptly, leaving only silence. Hannah collapsed, her legs giving out, and Obsidian caught her before she hit the ground. He was battered, bleeding from a dozen wounds, but he was smiling, fierce and triumphant. "It is done," he said. "He is sealed, forever." She laughed, breathless and dizzy, and leaned against him. "We did it, you did it." He pulled her closer, his arms around her, and she felt his heartbeat, slow and steady against her cheek. "You are extraordinary." She closed her eyes and let herself rest just for a moment in the circle of his arms. They emerged from the mine at dawn, and the sun was just breaking over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Obsidian flinched at the light, his skin prickling, and Hannah realized with a jolt that he had spent the entire night underground, risking the sunrise to see the ritual through. "We need to get you inside," she said. "I am fine. You are smoking." He looked down at his hands, which were indeed smoking faintly in the light, and he laughed. "Perhaps you are right." They made it back to her apartment just as the sun cleared the peaks, and Obsidian collapsed on her couch with a groan that sounded almost human. Hannah pulled the blackout curtains and turned on a lamp, and when she looked at him, she saw that his wounds were already healing, the cuts sealing, the bruises fading. "How long until I start healing like that?" she asked. 3 days, maybe 4. The transformation takes time." She nodded and sat beside him, suddenly exhausted. Her leg was aching, her head was pounding, and her palm was still bleeding sluggishly from the ritual cut. She wrapped it in a dish towel and leaned back, closing her eyes. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we wait. The transformation will begin tonight, and it will last 3 days. It will not be pleasant." "I assumed as much." He reached out and took her hand, careful of the wound. "I will be with you every moment. I will not leave you." She opened her eyes and looked at him, at the face that was too beautiful to be human, too perfect to be real, and she saw beneath the perfection to the person who had spent 200 years alone, holding a seal, carrying a burden he had never asked for. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For pulling me out of the dark, for trusting me, for letting me help." He smiled, and it was soft, real, the expression of someone who had forgotten how to smile and was remembering. "Thank you for reminding me what it feels like to not be alone." The transformation began that night, and it was every bit as unpleasant as Obsidian had warned. Her body burned, her bones ached, her senses sharpened and twisted until she could hear the heartbeat of a mouse in the walls and smell the individual components of the dust in the air. She spent 3 days in a fever haze, drifting in and out of consciousness, and every time she woke, Obsidian was there, sitting beside her bed, his hand in hers. He brought her blood on the second day, warm and fresh, in a glass, and she drank it without hesitation, because the hunger was overwhelming, and the taste was better than anything she had ever known. He told her it was from a blood bank, that he had connections, and she believed him because she had to. On the 4th day, she woke clear-headed and whole, and she knew immediately that she was different. Her body felt light, strong, effortless. Her senses were a symphony of detail, every texture, every scent, every sound sharp and distinct. She sat up and looked at her hands, which were paler than they had been, the veins faint beneath the skin, and she felt something settle inside her, a knowledge of what she had become. Obsidian was asleep in the chair beside her bed, his head tipped back, his white hair falling over his shoulders, and she realized it was the first time she had seen him vulnerable. She stood, careful not to wake him, and walked to the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, familiar and strange. Her skin was pale, her eyes darker, her features sharper. She looked like herself, but elevated, refined, as if someone had taken her and carved away everything unnecessary. "You are beautiful," Obsidian said from behind her, and she turned to find him awake, watching her with an expression of quiet wonder. "I am different. You are still you, just more so." She looked back at the mirror, and she thought about what she had given up and what she had gained, and she found, to her surprise, that she did not regret it. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we deal with Silver Peak." They went to the authorities 3 days later, armed with evidence Thomas had helped them compile. Photographs, journal entries, financial records showing payments to a shell company linked to Lucian. The FBI took their statement, skeptical at first, but the evidence was overwhelming, and within a week Silver Peak's executives were arrested, the mine was permanently closed, and the families of the 31 miners were offered a settlement that actually reflected the value of the lives lost. Hannah testified at the trial, and she told the truth, most of it. She said the company had ignored safety protocols, had drilled into unstable rock, had prioritized profit over lives. She did not mention vampires or rituals or ancient seals, and no one asked. The trial lasted 3 months, and at the end of it Silver Peak Mining was dissolved, its assets liquidated, its executives facing federal charges. The town of Silver Ridge mourned and healed, and Hannah found herself welcomed back, not as the geologist who had cleared the shaft, but as the survivor who had fought for justice. She stayed in Silver Ridge for another 6 months, helping the town transition away from mining, consulting on reclamation projects, teaching geology at the local high school. Obsidian stayed with her, a quiet presence, and slowly, carefully, they built something that looked like a life together. It was not always easy. She had to learn to navigate her new senses, her new hunger, the way the world looked different through immortal eyes. He had to learn to let her in, to trust that she would not leave, that she was not going to disappear the way everyone else in his long life had disappeared. But they learned, and somewhere in the learning she fell in love. It was not a single moment, not a dramatic revelation. It was 1,000 small things. The way he brought her coffee every morning, even though she did not need it anymore, just because she liked the ritual. The way he listened when she talked about her day, his full attention on her, as if nothing else in the world mattered. The way he held her at night, his arms around her, his face buried in her hair, and whispered that he had waited 500 years to feel this, to have someone to hold. She fell in love with his silence and his strength, and the way he looked at her like she was the only thing in the world worth seeing. And when she finally told him, 6 months and 3 days after the sealing, he looked at her with those black, depthless eyes and said, very simply, "I have loved you since the moment I pulled you from the dark." They married a year later in the drowned lower gallery of the mine, which had been drained and lit and transformed into an underground hall at Obsidian's direction. The town came, all 4,000 residents, and they filled the space with light and laughter and joy. And when Hannah walked down the makeshift aisle in a simple white dress, she saw the faces of the families she had fought for, and she knew she had made the right choice. Obsidian waited for her at the end of the aisle, dressed in black, his white hair loose around his shoulders. And when she reached him, he took her hands and said the vows they had written together, promises of eternity and partnership and love that would outlast the mountains. They sealed the vows with a kiss, and the hall erupted in applause, and Hannah thought, not for the first time, that being buried under 400 tons of rock was the best thing that had ever happened to her. They left Silver Ridge 2 years later, when the town no longer needed them and Hannah's lack of aging was starting to attract attention. Obsidian kept his promise, and they traveled the world, visiting every place Hannah had ever wanted to see and 100 she had never imagined. They walked the streets of Prague at midnight, explored the ruins of Angkor Wat, swam in the warm waters of the Maldives, and everywhere they went, they built memories, layers of shared experience that would carry them through the eternity ahead. They returned to Silver Ridge every few years, quietly to tend the memorial that had been erected for the 31 miners, to leave flowers and stand in silence and remember the price that had been paid. And every time Hannah thought about the woman she had been, buried in the dark, counting breaths, and the woman she had become, walking in the light with the vampire king who had torn Boulders apart to reach her. She had given up her mortality, her ability to have children, her normal human life. And in return she had gained eternity, love, and a purpose that mattered. It was, she thought, a fair trade. 50 years after the sealing, they returned to the valley one last time and stood at the entrance to the old mine, now overgrown with trees and reclaimed by the forest. The town had moved on, diversified, thrived, and the memory of Silver Peak mining had faded into history. A cautionary tale told to children about the dangers of greed. Obsidian took her hand, and together they walked into the trees, leaving the past behind, stepping into a future that stretched out before them, infinite and bright and full of possibility. And in the deep gallery, 300 meters below, the stone seal held, unbroken, eternal, a testament to the sacrifice of two people who had loved each other enough to give up everything, and had found in the giving that they had gained the world.